The grand ballroom shimmered with a cold sort of beauty, the kind that money could buy but warmth could not. Crystal chandeliers rained light down on velvet-draped tables where men in tuxedos and women in gowns sparkled like walking jewels. The air smelled of champagne and expensive perfume, laughter rippling through the crowd like waves that never reached the shore. At the heart of it all stood Richard Hale, a man who carried his wealth not just in his bank account but in every smirk, every gesture, every careless word that fell from his lips. His suit was tailored within an inch of perfection, his watch worth more than most people's houses, and his ego was the loudest thing in the room. Maya Carter moved silently between tables, balancing her tray with a practiced steadiness that came from years of quiet resilience. She wore the standard black and white uniform of the serving staff, pressed but unremarkable, blending her into the background like she was supposed to. Yet there was something about her, an energy in the way she held herself, shoulders straight, eyes steady, that set her apart. Guests rarely noticed the staff, but more than one person found their gaze lingering on her before they shook it off and returned to their shallow conversations. Richard, however, noticed for an entirely different reason. He was bored. He had heard the speeches, seen the performances, toasted with the mayor and shaken the hands of people he either liked nor respected. Now, with his glass refilled for the third time, his restless eyes searched for amusement. They landed on Maya as she placed a flute of champagne onto a nearby table, her movements graceful in a way that seemed too deliberate for a simple waitress. A spark of cruelty lit his face. "This evening is dull," Richard declared loudly, his voice carrying just enough for nearby guests to hear. His companions, executives, lawyers, and sycophants, turned toward him, expectant. He pointed a finger in Maya's direction, his smile sharp as a blade. "You there. Why don't you give us something worth watching? Show us a dance." The room shifted, a ripple of discomfort moving through the tables closest to him. Maya froze mid-step, the tray still balanced in her hands. For a second, she wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. Her heart stuttered in her chest, but her face betrayed nothing. She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his with quiet composure. "I'm here to serve, sir," she said softly, her tone even. "Not to perform." His friends chuckled, a low wave of amusement that only encouraged him. Richard leaned back in his chair, stretching his arm along the backrest like a king presiding over his court. "Don't be shy," he pressed, his grin widening. "Everyone loves a little spectacle. Prove you can do more than carry glasses." The laughter grew louder. Some guests smiled nervously, glancing away, while others leaned in, eager to see how far he would push it. Maya's fingers tightened against the tray. Heat spread across her cheeks, not from shame, but from the sting of being put on display like she was a toy, an object meant for their amusement. Still, she stood tall. "Do you really want that?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with steel. The question caught him off guard for a moment, but he quickly masked it with another laugh. "Of course I do," he said, lifting his glass. "Tell you what. If you manage to surprise me, I'll write a check to this little charity so large it'll make the mayor blush." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. The wager was reckless, spoken in arrogance but sealed by the fact that dozens had heard it. Whispers sparked at the tables like kindling catching flame. The mayor himself raised his brows, watching with interest now. Maya inhaled slowly, steadying the storm that wanted to break free inside her. Every instinct told her to walk away, to let the insult slide off her back the way she had trained herself to for years. But something deeper, an ember long buried, ignited in her chest. This was not just about her anymore. His cruelty was public. So too would be her answer. She set her tray carefully on a nearby table, aligning the glasses with precision, as though she had all the time in the world. Her hands trembled faintly, but her gaze never wavered from Richard's. The noise in the room faded to a dull hum as people craned their necks, watching, waiting. Maya stepped into the open space at the center of the ballroom. The parquet floor gleamed under the light, reflecting her slim figure, as though the stage had been waiting for her all along. She felt the weight of every eye pressing down, some filled with pity, some with hunger for entertainment, and a few with something else, hope, maybe. Richard chuckled, sipping his champagne, already certain of the outcome. To him, she was a waitress, nothing more. She could try, she could flounder, but in the end, it would be his laughter that echoed through the hall. Maya took a breath so deep it seemed to anchor her body to the floor. Her heartbeat was thunder in her ears, but her spine lengthened, her chin lifted, and something unreadable flickered across her face. The music from the band softened as the conductor raised a questioning brow. Richard gave an exaggerated wave, signaling them to play something light and fast, the kind of rhythm meant to mock rather than inspire. The first notes floated through the air, quick and biting. Maya didn't move. She stood perfectly still, letting the sound wash over her, letting the anticipation stretch like a bowstring pulled taut. Every second of stillness was electric, pulling the audience tighter into the moment. Her eyes swept the room once, briefly meeting the gaze of strangers, reminding them she was not invisible. She was here, and they would see her. And then, she shifted. Just a single step, a subtle roll of her shoulders, a sway so small it might have gone unnoticed if the room weren't holding its breath. But there was power in that first motion, like the beginning of a storm. The murmurs started, low and uncertain, curiosity sparking even in those who had been eager for her embarrassment. She let the rhythm carry her a little further, another step, another twist of her body, the tray forgotten, the insult transformed into fuel. What Richard had thought would be her downfall was quickly becoming something else entirely. And though no one could see it yet, Maya knew. The floor beneath her feet, the lights above her head, the silence of the crowd leaning forward, all of it belonged to her now. The moment stretched, the music gathering pace, and with it, the fire inside her chest. She was ready to answer his dare, not with submission, but with something that would sear itself into memory. And as she lifted her chin, poised to let go of restraint, every single person in the room leaned forward, waiting for the moment when the waitress would either falter or shock them all. The air was heavy, thick with expectation, as the first notes of the band's forced melody carried through the hall. Guests leaned forward in their seats, caught in the tension between cruelty and curiosity. The music was fast, upbeat, the kind of rhythm Richard had demanded, something mocking, something that would make her stumble if she dared to try. He leaned back in his chair, his smirk broad and confident, sure that humiliation was only moments away. His friends chuckled among themselves, eager spectators at what they thought would be the collapse of a waitress's dignity. Maya felt the sting of their laughter cut through her, but she did not let it break her. Instead, she let the sound of the drums and brass soak into her skin, steadying her breath, finding the pulse beneath the noise. For a moment, she stood as if carved from marble, her body motionless against the tide of expectation. Then, as if a switch had been flicked deep within, her shoulders rolled, her arms extended, and her feet moved with a grace so natural it silenced the laughter in an instant. The sway was slow at first, deliberate, almost defiant. A tilt of her head, a bend of her knee, the curl of her hand through the air, it was enough to suggest something was building, something no one had anticipated. The murmurs began, soft but growing. Then, in one fluid motion, Maya turned, her spin sharp and controlled, the skirt of her uniform sweeping like a dancer's costume. Gasps broke out, and the band, caught by surprise, faltered for a beat before instinctively leaning into her rhythm, matching her energy as though she were the conductor of the entire room. Her body became a story. Each step, each movement was filled with rhythm, with discipline, with a fire that had been waiting for release. She danced as though she had been born to it, her frame light and fluid, her movements precise and expressive. Her eyes no longer looked at the floor or at the wealthy men and women surrounding her. Her gaze was steady, lifted, alive. Every arc of her arms carved the air like poetry, every turn stamped against the silence that Richard's arrogance had created. The laughter had stopped. The murmurs were no longer mocking but awed, surprised. This was no fumbling attempt to appease a cruel dare. This was art, raw and defiant. Maya's body seemed to carry not only her own pride but the weight of everyone who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or belittled. Her performance demanded recognition, and the crowd could not look away. Richard's smirk faltered. His glass hovered at his lips, forgotten. He leaned forward, his brows narrowing, as though trying to reconcile what he was seeing with the image of the waitress he had chosen to ridicule. His friends whispered among themselves, their amusement dying in their throats. One of them chuckled nervously, trying to pretend the game was still his, but even he could not deny the shift in the room. The musicians, emboldened by her presence, added flourishes of their own, saxophones soaring, drums pounding like a heartbeat in sync with her steps. Maya moved with them effortlessly, her spins sharper, her leaps higher, her rhythm so precise it felt impossible she had been carrying trays only minutes before. Every second that passed drew her further away from the image of a servant, and closer to something luminous, unforgettable. The applause began in scattered claps, hesitant at first, from those who could not contain themselves. Then it swelled, spreading through the hall like fire catching dry grass. The sound grew louder with every movement, the roar of appreciation building until the walls themselves seemed to vibrate. The guests were no longer waiting for her to fall, they were enthralled, carried by the brilliance of what they were witnessing. Maya's chest rose and fell with the effort, but she did not falter. If anything, the energy of the crowd fueled her. She spun faster, her hair catching the light, her arms cutting through the air with precision that belonged on a stage, not a ballroom floor. Every motion was defiance, every beat a declaration. She was not a toy for their amusement. She was power, she was beauty, she was art incarnate. She finished in a crouched pose, one knee bent, her arms extended like wings, her eyes burning with fire. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. Then, as though released from a spell, the crowd erupted into thunderous applause, rising to their feet in ovation. The sound thundered across the hall, echoing, reverberating, drowning out everything else. Maya held her pose for only a moment before rising slowly, her chin high, her breath heavy but steady. She had not just danced, she had conquered. And in that triumph, Richard Hales sat frozen. His face was pale, his jaw tight, his pride cut open before the very people he had tried to impress. The attention, the admiration, the roaring applause, none of it was for him. It was all for the woman he had tried to belittle. His glass shook faintly in his hand, the liquid inside trembling. His companions avoided his gaze now, their whispers carrying a different tone, embarrassment, disbelief, even a touch of ridicule. Richard had lost control of the room, and worse, he had lost it to the very person he had treated as beneath him. Maya's eyes flicked toward him, just for a second. There was no smile on her face, no gloating. Only quiet strength, the kind that made his arrogance seem small, pitiful. That single glance was sharper than any insult she could have spoken aloud. Richard stood abruptly, forcing his chair back with a screech across the polished floor. The applause quieted, tension flooding back into the air. His pride demanded he claw back what he had lost, to twist the narrative back into his favor. He raised his voice, booming, trying to command attention again. "That was impressive," he said, though his tone was thick with bitterness. "But let's be honest, luck can look like talent when no one challenges it." He turned toward the band, snapping his fingers. "Play something harder. Faster. Let's see how well our waitress fares when she has a real partner." He extended his hand toward Maya, his eyes cold, daring her once more. The crowd murmured, the drama pulling them back in. Some gasped, some leaned closer, and some looked to Maya with anticipation, wondering if she would retreat now that the stakes had risen. Her chest still heaved from the effort, her body alive with the fire of what she had just accomplished. She looked at his hand, at the man who refused to surrender his ego, and then back into the sea of eyes watching her every move. Her answer, whatever it would be, hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. And with the music beginning to shift, faster, sharper, every soul in that grand room knew the night was far from over. Richard's hand hung in the air, daring her to take it, daring her to risk what he believed would be her undoing. The ballroom was caught in a suspended silence, every guest watching to see what she would do. Some expected her to shrink back, to retreat into the anonymity of her uniform, to let the moment end before his cruelty could sharpen again. But Maya did not flinch. Her eyes met his, steady and unblinking, and then, with deliberate calm, she placed her hand in his. The crowd stirred, murmurs of surprise and excitement weaving through the air like a second rhythm. Richard's grip was firm, almost punishing, as if he could reassert his power through the strength of his hand alone. He pulled her toward him with an arrogant flourish, forcing her into the center of the floor as though she were his possession. The band, sensing the tension, struck up a faster tune, sharp staccatos and urgent beats filling the hall with energy. Richard smiled, a grin that bore no warmth, only the promise of domination. He moved first, a stiff but forceful step, dragging her into motion. His style was aggressive, all about display, with none of the grace that marked true dance. He wanted control, wanted the audience to see him lead and her follow. But Maya absorbed his force and transformed it. Where he pushed, she bent and swayed, turning his rigidity into fluid elegance. Where he yanked, she spun, making his movements look clumsy by comparison. The crowd began to notice. Their whispers were no longer sympathetic for her but amused at him. "He's stumbling," one guest muttered under their breath. "She's carrying him," another said, unable to hide the astonishment. Richard's jaw tightened, his steps growing heavier, more desperate. He twirled her with unnecessary strength, trying to break her rhythm, but she pivoted on the ball of her foot with effortless precision, landing in perfect timing with the band's rise. Her breath was steady, her face calm, her body a vessel of practiced control. She was no longer just reacting, she was guiding. Subtly at first, so it looked like she was following his lead, but each motion brought the truth into sharper focus. She was dictating the dance, and he was stumbling to keep up. His suit jacket flared awkwardly as he tried to mirror her spins. His steps clashed against the music, too forceful, too late, too heavy. She, by contrast, glided like water, redirecting his weight and his pride into a performance that dazzled everyone watching. "You planned this," he hissed under his breath, his face close to hers, his voice venom behind his forced smile. "No," Maya answered quietly, her eyes burning with something unshakable. "I just stopped hiding." Her words struck harder than any stumble could. He tried to twirl her again, but she released his grip, spinning away, her arms extended, her body catching the rhythm perfectly. The band, sensing her dominance, quickened the pace. The saxophone screamed, the drums thundered, the violins swirled into a crescendo. Maya launched into a solo sequence, her body leaping and twirling with the kind of control that only comes from years of secret devotion. Her feet struck the floor in sharp beats, each one in time, each one a reminder that she was more than he had ever allowed her to be. Gasps erupted around the room. Applause began even before she had finished the sequence. Guests leaned forward, their eyes wide, unable to believe that the waitress who had been invisible minutes ago was now commanding the space with such breathtaking brilliance. Richard lunged to catch her hand again, but his timing was wrong, his step offbeat. He stumbled. His polished shoes slid across the floor, and for a terrifying second, he nearly fell to his knees. The sound of laughter broke from one side of the room. Not loud, not cruel, just a chuckle someone couldn't hold back. But it was enough. Richard's face burned crimson. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself upright, but the damage had been done. His attempt at regaining control had turned into a spectacle of his own weakness. He had tried to humiliate her, but he was the one unraveling before everyone's eyes. Maya didn't need to exploit his mistake. She simply danced on, her body a flowing contrast to his faltering presence. Every step she took magnified the gap between them, between grace and arrogance, between art and ego, between dignity and cruelty. She was no longer the subject of his dare. She was the center of the story, the force that no one could deny. The crowd erupted into cheers as she leaped into another spin, her skirt flaring, her arms a perfect arc of elegance. The applause grew, louder and louder, until it drowned out even the music. Guests clapped to the beat, stomping their feet, swept into the energy she created. Some even shouted encouragement, their voices carrying across the room like sparks in the firestorm of her triumph. Richard, drenched in sweat, struggled to keep up. His breath came heavy, his movements sloppy, his pride collapsing under the weight of the spectacle. He tried once more to assert control, grabbing her wrist mid-spin, but she twisted effortlessly, freeing herself, turning his aggression into another dazzling flourish. Her eyes met his for just an instant, and the message was clear: this was no longer his stage. With one final burst of energy, Maya launched into a sequence that left the room breathless. A whirl of motion, a leap, a turn, a landing so precise it seemed to defy gravity itself. She ended with her arms raised, her chest heaving, her eyes fierce. The band struck its last note, perfectly aligned with her final pose. For a moment, silence blanketed the hall. Then, like a storm breaking, the room exploded with sound, cheers, whistles, applause so loud it shook the chandeliers. People rose to their feet, clapping furiously, their admiration directed solely at her. They had come expecting to be entertained by wealth and power. Instead, they had been humbled by courage and hidden brilliance. Richard stood beside her, red-faced and trembling, his body stiff, his pride shattered. He could not bow, could not smile, could not pretend he had won. His failure was too obvious, too complete. And Maya stood tall, not gloating, not mocking, but radiant with the undeniable truth of her triumph. The spotlight swung between them, catching Richard's humiliation and Maya's victory in the same frame. The audience leaned forward, their voices still rising, waiting to see what would come next. Would Richard accept his defeat? Would he honor his wager? Or would his arrogance drive him into one final, desperate act? The tension hung heavy, the air charged with expectation. The game he had started was now out of his hands, and the power he had clung to so tightly had slipped through his fingers like sand. And as the applause roared around her, Maya knew this was only the beginning. The final reckoning had yet to come. The applause roared on, rolling through the grand ballroom like thunder breaking against stone walls. Maya stood in the center of it, chest heaving, the heat of her triumph glowing across her skin. She had taken the dare and shattered every expectation, and now the crowd had crowned her in their applause. For a moment she simply stood there, letting it wash over her, letting it fill the spaces inside her that had long been starved of recognition. Richard, however, stood rigid at her side. His jaw was clenched so tightly it looked as though his teeth might crack. His once smug expression was gone, replaced by a mask of strained composure. He tugged at his collar, beads of sweat gathering along his temple. He had meant for this to be her humiliation, a cruel joke to amuse his peers. Instead, it had become his downfall, and the crowd, though polite, could not hide where their admiration had shifted. Every cheer for Maya was a knife in his pride. The mayor rose from his table, his hands clapping deliberately, slowly, commanding the room. "Extraordinary," he said, his voice booming above the din. "A performance worthy of the finest stage." The crowd roared again in agreement, whistles and shouts breaking through the applause. People were not merely entertained, they were moved, changed by what they had seen. Maya bowed her head slightly, her eyes glistening but steady. She had not done this for recognition, yet the recognition felt like justice. And then she remembered. Richard's words, smug and cruel, floated back through her mind. "If you surprise me, I'll write a check to the charity with enough zeros to make the mayor blush." The room began to quiet as she lifted her gaze toward him. Her voice was calm, but it carried across the floor with strength and clarity. "You made a promise," she said. All eyes turned to Richard. His face darkened, the muscles in his jaw twitching. For a moment, he looked as though he might refuse, as though his pride might override even the public oath he had foolishly made. But the eyes of the city's elite were on him. Cameras were out now, flashing, recording, catching every twitch of his mouth, every bead of sweat. If he broke his word here, it would follow him forever. His hand shook slightly as he reached for his checkbook. He pulled a pen from his pocket, the motion stiff and mechanical, and began to write. The scratching of the pen against the paper was almost loud in the silence, every stroke a carving of his pride into something he could no longer hold. When he tore the check free, his hand trembled, and he thrust it toward the charity director without meeting anyone's eye. The director unfolded it, glanced at the amount, and blinked in shock. His voice wavered as he read it aloud. The number was staggering, more than the charity had ever received in a single donation. Gasps spread through the room, then applause, swelling larger than before. Maya watched him, her face serene, while Richard sat heavily back in his chair, his head lowered slightly, the fight drained from him. But the damage was already done. His humiliation had been public, his arrogance dismantled in the most spectacular way possible. His attempt at cruelty had forced him to generosity. His sneer had turned into an unwilling gift. No wealth, no influence, no insult could erase the image burned into the minds of everyone in that hall. Richard Hale, outshone and undone by the waitress he had tried to belittle. Maya turned away from him, her steps measured, her head high. The crowd parted for her, as though she were royalty. She passed the mayor, who gave her a respectful nod, then continued toward the velvet curtain at the back of the hall. Each step felt lighter than the last, each breath freer. She had been invisible when she entered this ballroom. Now she left it as the name on everyone's lips, not because she had sought their approval, but because she had refused to be diminished. Whispers followed her. "Who is she? Where did she learn that? She's remarkable." Some guests clapped again as she passed, others reached for her hand, but she kept walking, graceful and steady. The curtain swallowed her figure, and with her disappearance, the room seemed to lose its warmth, as though she had taken the light with her. Richard remained slumped in his chair, his glass of champagne untouched beside him. His friends whispered uneasily, no longer laughing, their loyalty brittle. He felt their eyes on him, felt their unspoken judgment. He had come into this night expecting to dominate, to remind everyone of his status, his wealth, his untouchable arrogance. Instead, he had given them something they would never forget, the sight of a waitress teaching him humility in front of the entire city. The rest of the evening passed in a haze for him. The speeches, the music, the polite chatter, it was all background noise against the thunder of his humiliation. Every cheer for Maya was a reminder of his loss. Every smile that avoided his gaze was a wound. By the time the gala ended, he could barely stand to look anyone in the eye. He left quickly, his head bowed, a shadow of the man who had walked in. But for Maya, the night was not about his downfall. It was about something larger, something she had carried inside her for years. Her passion, her strength, her dignity, they had all been given a stage, even if it had been offered through cruelty. She had claimed it, transformed it, and left it as hers. Back in the quiet of the staff corridor, she leaned against the wall, her breath finally releasing in a shaky exhale. She smiled to herself, small and private, a smile of relief, of triumph, of quiet pride. She knew her life might not change overnight. She would still wake the next morning to bills and long shifts and the reality of her world. But she also knew she had given them something unforgettable, something that no one could ever take away from her. And as the ballroom behind her buzzed with talk of her name, her dance, her courage, Maya walked out into the cool night air, the stars bright above her. She didn't need their applause anymore. She had taken back her story. In that glittering hall built for the powerful, it was not the millionaire who had owned the night. It was the waitress who had walked away as the true queen of the gala.